Hey everyone, so today we're going to be looking at a complex chord progression and taking it apart to figure out how it works. Along the way we'll look at subjects like cadence, harmonic function, chromatic chords, passing chords, walk-ups and walk-downs and quite a bit more. Here's the progression that we're going to be using. It's from a song that I'm writing at the moment called The Brilliant and the Beautiful. If you want to hear the full song, then when I've finished it I may well get it recorded and post it here. First though, let me give it a playthrough. I've put the chords and a lead sheet of the melody in a PDF. You'll find a link for it in the description text below. I'll stick some of the melody over the top as I play. Here we go. Okay, so let's try and make sense of some of these weird symbols that I've got in the progression. Now, some of the stuff that I'm notating here is reasonably complex and there isn't a single accepted way of notating it in chord progressions, okay? I'm going to show you the way I do it, and a lot of other people use these kind of techniques as well, but I'm not saying it's the only way of showing these things, okay? So just bear that in mind. Let's start off by looking at these red chords in brackets underneath the main flow of the progression. I'm using those to indicate passing chords that take up less than a single beat, okay? They will be really hard to represent within the progression, so I've just stuck them underneath the main flow there. Let's look at this one in bar 10 to show you what I mean, the A-7 chord. What happens in bar 10, we've got 2 beats of D-7 and 2 beats of B flat, and then we go into an F chord at the start of bar 11, just here, but we have that A-7 passing chord, and it goes something like this. There's a D-7, okay, and so from the B flat, and there I am on the F at the start of bar 11. So that A-7 actually happened really, really briefly, and so it's marked in as a brief passing chord like that. So that's what those things are. Now, these little marks underneath the bars here, I'm using to show beat division. Okay, now usually when you see a chord progression like this, if you have, and it's in 4/4 time, and you have a single chord in a bar, you assume it has all 4 beats of the bar. If you see a bar like this, look at bar 13, F, D9, you assume that the first chord has 2 beats and the second chord has 2 beats, but it doesn't always work like that. Sometimes you need to show beat division more carefully. So for example, in bar 3, I want to show that the 4 chords each have 1 beat each. Okay, so D minor, D flat augmented, F over C, B-7 flat 5, 1 beat each. That's fairly straightforward. When we get to bar 6, it's a bit more complicated because we've got 3 chords, D-7 for 1 beat of the C over E, but then 2 beats of the B flat over F. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so that's all that I'm doing there really. That is reasonably self-explanatory. It gets a bit more complicated when we get down here, okay, to bar 12, where we have some very awkward timing. Let me just play through bar 12. It goes something like this. Now the timing goes so crazy there that I've actually notated that single bar in a different time signature, 3/4, 3 beats per bar. That's not going to be super exact either because the song needs quite a lot of rubato, and in this particular bar any singer is going to play around with the timing. 3/4 is just the closest approximation of what's actually going on. After bar 12, we go straight back into 4/4 at bar 13. But then we've got the added complication that I'm actually bringing the F chord from the next bar in a little bit early. There's a really important lesson here. We're really pushing up hard against the limits of what chord charts can actually do. Once stuff starts to get really complicated and you really want to spell things out precisely, you have to go to score, okay? Because it's a far more precise way of spelling out music. And then finally at the end, in grey, I just wanted to mark this section as turnarounds. If you look at the melody again in the PDF, you'll see that the actual melody ends at the end of bar 14. And then we have this turnaround section, which is a little section of chords designed to take us back to the beginning. So let's think about how I actually built this progression, because there's a really important point that I want you to take on board here. Really what this is quite a simple chord progression dressed up. Now, when we're playing jazz, when we're playing blues, often what we will do is take a fairly straightforward chord progression and use things like chord extension and chord substitution to make it richer and more interesting. Say, for example, if we had a song in F that we were working on in a jazzy style, and we came across a C7 chord, we might substitute that instead for what we call a tritone substitution. In that case, that's G flat 7 over C, okay? All that's happening in this progression is that I've taken some of those ideas around chord substitution and chord extension, which I've talked about on the channel loads in the past, and just baked them straight into the progression. If we strip this progression down to its basics, it might look something like this. Now, if I played this progression with the melody over the top, it would still work. This is a really important point. Between the basic progression and the kind of dressed up, fancified version, functionally, the harmony hasn't changed. What do I mean by that when I talk about functional harmony? Okay, big question there. If we're in the key of F major, as you may well know, we have 7 naturally occurring chords in that key, what we call the diatonic chords of that key. F, G minor, A minor, B flat, C, D minor, E diminished, and then back to F at the top of the scale. And if you look at that chord progression, most, not all, but most of the chords in that progression are at least based on those very simple 7 diatonic chords. We have some non-diatonic chords, some chromatic chords that I've brought in from elsewhere to create a little bit of colour, but most of those chords are taken from that list of diatonic. Now, in any major key, each of those diatonic chords has a job, a particular function that it fulfills in moving a progression forward. So, for example, the job of the number 1 chord, the F chord in the key of F major, is what we would call the tonic function. Its job is to sound like home. When we get to an F chord, we sound like we've reached a settled state, okay, and maybe the end of the progression. Then you have the 5 chord, which we call the dominant chord. It has a dominant function. Its job is to take us back home. So when we're on a 5 chord, it's really trying to pull us back really strongly back to the number 1 chord, the tonic chord. And then we get, for example, the number 4 chord, which we would say had, we call it the subdominant chord, but we would say it had a subdominant or a predominant function. And its job, like it says on the tin, is predominant. So the 4 chord, the subdominant chord, typically comes before the dominant chord, which then comes before the tonic chord, the number 1 chord. But other chords, apart from those 3, also can fit into those roles. So, for example, G minor, the number 2 chord in F major, also has a predominant function. It also wants to take us to the number 5 chord to get back to the number 1 chord. You might have come across the 2-5-1 progression, which is really common in jazz. That's all that is. 2, 5, 1. Okay, and then chords like A minor can also have a tonic function, as can D minor. The 6th chord, D minor, tends to kind of sit between the two. Sometimes it can have a tonic type function because it's the tonic chord of the relative minor key. Sometimes it can have more of a predominant function. So any chord that you see in a progression is generally doing a job. Either it's one of the diatonic chords, it has a functional role, or it's a chromatic chord, a non-diatonic chord, brought in to achieve a particular effect. Now, the way those chords functionally relate to each other is quite important, because usually in a progression, the sequence goes from a tonic type chord to a subdominant or predominant type chord to a dominant chord, and then back to the tonic, and the sequence repeats. And that all depends on the use of cadences. Okay, so from the dominant chord, we would typically have what we call an authentic cadence that takes us back to the tonic chord, C to F, 5-1. Okay, so a cadence, I was talking about them in another tutorial just a couple of weeks ago. A cadence describes the relationship between two chords that have a functional relationship, if you like, and how one chord resolves to another. However, that doesn't always happen. It's not always an authentic cadence, and we can see that happening quite a lot here. Sometimes we get what we call an interrupted cadence. So for example, in bar 6, where we go D minor or D minor 7, then C over E, then B flat over F, that C over E normally you would expect to resolve to a number 1 chord, an authentic cadence, but it doesn't. Instead, it resolves to the B flat. Okay, what we would normally expect hasn't happened, and we have instead what we call an interrupted cadence. Okay, really common. Just something I quickly want to mention here, you'll notice that I'm using a lot of slash chords. I'm very often specifying the bass note that I want you to use in a particular chord. That's because I'm after a particular sound for this song. Okay, again, if we look at bar 6, if you listen to that D minor 7 C slash E B flat slash F. Okay, now if I didn't make them slash chords, if I just played the regular root note to the chord in the bass, D minor 7, C, B flat, it would still work perfectly well. The chords would function in just the same way, but the quality of the sound will be different. I've said this often before, but slash chords change the quality of the sound you're making. Okay, so when we go D minor 7, C over E, B flat over F, it's a little bit more on edge, it's a little bit less stable than it would be if the regular bass notes were, the regular root notes were in the bass. And again, I'm just using that because that's a particular musical effect that I want at that point. Just before we go any further, don't forget to give this video a like, and also maybe subscribe to my YouTube channel if you like this kind of stuff, because I've got literally hundreds of tutorials just like this one. You might also like to check out some of my stuff, especially my books. Right now you can get a really great deal on 3 of my ebooks: How to Really Play the Piano, the Stuff Your Teacher Never Taught You, An Introduction to Cocktail Piano, and 7 Studies in Pop Piano. I've got a bundle deal running on those 3. You can get them all for £18.95, which is a 30% saving on what you would pay if you bought them separately. Okay, so shortly what I hope you'll do is dig into the PDF and start exploring these chords for yourself. Like I said, if you're not sure of what any of them are, go back to the playthrough section and just copy what I was doing so you can figure out exactly what these, what makes these chords work. Just before you do that, there are just 1 or 2 extra things that I want to mention. First of all, I really want you to think about the expression in this piece, because it is designed to be very expressive, and you'll probably find that it's at its most expressive when you've got passing chords and little bits of harmonic richness. Okay, so if you think about bar 5, okay, that's a really rich moment there. So kind of, if you're playing through, really kind of milk it, yeah? You can use chords to create expressive feelings like that very easily. I love that little, I shouldn't say this stuff about things that I've written myself, but I love that little It's really simple, but also really powerful. And it's a nice contrast with the chord that has come immediately beforehand, which is this A with the sharp 9th. This is a chord I've always loved, okay? So it's an A chord, but with a C natural at the top of it. When you play an 8 sharp 9th, you always try to, or any sort of sharp 9th, you always try to keep the minor 3rd away from the major 3rd, else it sounds really clashing, okay? But like that, that's really kind of crunchy, brutal kind of sounding chord, but then you go from that kind of harshness to the, yeah? That's what music's all about creating contrasts. Also think about some of the walk-ups and walk-downs that I'm using. That's where we're going up or down, especially in the bass, to create kind of interesting sounds. Although it happens in the right as well. In bar 3, we've got the, really that could just be a D minor chord all the way through, or it could be D minor and then B minor 7 flat 5. But I create a kind of mini walk-down. Going down the chromatic scale like that. Again, it just kind of creates a little bit of interest. There's also another pretty good walk up in bar 14, which I've written just as G minor 7 and the G minor 13 with a C in the bass. That's kind of an approximation, because what I would usually play there is something like this. Okay, and a little bit of anticipation coming onto the F chord at the start of the turnaround there. So again, notice what was happening in the bass. So I was walking up from the root of the first chord, okay, up to the C, which gives me that strong kind of you know, dominant function to resolve to the A, even though that G minor 13 is pretty, you know, a pretty far distant substitution from a C7 chord. You know, that would be the underlying chord there if we spelt the progression really, really simply. So just watch out for opportunities for little walk-ups and walk-downs like that. And if you're creating a progression like this for yourself, do try to drop some of them in. Okay, so that's it for this tutorial. I hope you found it useful. The main thing for you to do now is to download that PDF. Like I said, it's entirely free. Link in the description text down below, and start playing around with this for yourself, because you might find it interesting. You'll find it teaches you a lot about how chords and progressions like this work, and it might also give you a bit of inspiration for creating your own progressions. I'll see you next time.